The Mechonoids were large, geodesic, polyhedric robots which made their one and only screen appearance at the end of the Doctor Who serial The Chase in 1965. They were visualised by Raymond Cusick and built by Shawcraft Models, but they were conceived by Terry Nation, and he made no secret of his motivation for coming up with another outlandish and visually interesting non-humanoid monster. When asked if his intention was to invent something else to make money on merchandise just like the Daleks, he replied,
"Absolutely right it was. With the Mechonoids, you had your eye on the chance that anything could catch on."
However, unlike the Daleks, Terry Nation had carefully described the exact shape of his new robots, yet what he asked for was not what ended up on screen. He also devised another potentially marketable toy to appear in The Chase, which was omitted from the final programme. So what were the reasons he didn't get the robots he asked for? How were they eventually built? And does one of them still survive today? When Doctor Who was in early development, the second serial was, at one stage, planned to be a story entitled The Robots, otherwise known as the Masters of Luxor. Written by Anthony Coburn, it saw the TARDIS arrive in a world dominated by robots. This story was eventually swapped out for another, written by Terry Nation, which would introduce the Daleks, and the rest is history. But I have a pet theory that, before the storyline for the Daleks was fully formed, and even before he put pen to paper, Terry Nation's original idea for the planet Skaro might have been a world populated entirely by creatures with naturally evolved metallic bodies. I have a hunch that the Magnodon in the first episode is a remnant of this idea, and a taster of what was to come ahead of their meeting with the Daleks. The Doctor deduces that this animal has evolved to hold its prey in a magnetic field, so that prey must also be metal. The Doctor asks Ian,
"Can't you imagine an animal unless it's flesh, blood and bone,
And soon after they encounter metal creatures that might well be the top of this crunchy food chain, the Daleks. Of course, what we think of as Daleks turned out to merely be their shell, machines for the mutations inside. I'm not suggesting that Terry Nation took a sudden left turn 10 pages into writing episode 1. We know from his storyline submission that the plot of what was originally called The Survivors was all about mutations from the nuclear war, but I just wonder if he was playing around with other ideas first, and this remnant survived. Nevertheless, when Terry Nation was invited back to write a third Dalek serial entitled The Chase, he wrote a synopsis delivered on the 10th of January 1965, whose final episode included what he described as a society of machines, built by man-like creatures 1,000 years before, destroyed by their own invention. The machines created new versions of themselves, built into their memory cells the order to kill. Strangely enough, this had a lot in common with Anthony Coburn's abandoned story, The Masters of Luxor. And stranger still, The Masters of Luxor had the plot element of an abandoned alien city built generations beforehand, whose power was sapping the TARDIS and preventing it from leaving, which coincidentally became the storyline of Death to the Daleks. The outline delivered by Nation introduces a logical component which is missing from the final script. In the finished TV version, the suggestion is that all the robots found on Mechanus are ones sent by Earth, but Nation's original concept was that the first generation of robots had replaced themselves with newer models, and this might explain any impractical elements of the Mechonoids that we see on screen. If these versions seemed unlikely as human slaves, perhaps this is because they were never designed for that function. Maybe these were designed by the cleaning robots, and maybe cleaning robots aren't very good at designing other robots. But as mentioned, this is never stated on screen. The reason for this omission is that the similarity to the Masters of Luxor had not escaped the notice of producer Verity Lambert. In a memo to director Richard Martin, she says that she will ask Terry Nation to change the backstory for the robots so as not to cause copyright issues with the other script. But if the idea of service robots building new hostile robots was removed, then they needed to have a different reason why the TARDIS crew were held captive. It was Lambert herself who came up with the idea that the Mechons were programmed to take prisoners of anyone who didn't know their code. Thus she personally fixed the plot hole that was created by removing the plot elements that had been too similar to the Masters of Luxor. The Masters of Luxor was eventually abandoned, but it was released as a script by Titan Books in 1992, and then adapted into a Big Finish audio adventure in their Lost Stories range, starring Carol Ann Ford and William Russell. Returning to Terry Nation's draft script for The Chase, he gave a detailed description of how he envisaged his new robots to look.
They are legless, moving on a round base,
announced the Daleks. The Mechon moves on the same principle as a Dalek, that is to say, legless.
I've hardly touched a drop!
The Mechon is shaped like a large spinning top. Good job he said it was large. Slightly convex at the top. Wide at the shoulders, then tapering in as it nears the ground. The taper then spreads into the base unit. Despite his eagerness to describe a spinning top in great detail, it doesn't narrow down the exact type he had in mind. But it sounds like he was thinking more of the wooden versions rather than the broader tin ones. And he also offers an alternative for clarification. Imagine a capstan with a pronounced top. Sprouting from the Mechon are antennae. No suggestion of head or arms or any human feature. However, there are a number of flashing discs built into the surface. Nation also had an idea for the sound design. Not only did he specify that it clicks and whirs as it moves, but he suggests the voice should be achieved in the same style as Sparky's Magic Piano, which was an episode of a children's audio series released on record in 1947.
I'll play anything you ask me to play for now.
He adds the note in the script, "Could you look into this, please?"
Mechonoid, English, input, enter, 0, stop.
His references to spinning tops and capstans indicate that he was hoping to avoid repeating the angular skirt of the Dalek design. The story goes that originally the Daleks would have had a curved surface, but it was supposedly vetoed at the design stage on the mistaken assumption that Shawcraft would be unable to make a curved surface. So they opted for flat panels instead. Although since the shoulders and dome of the Dalek are both curved and smooth, this seems a slightly dubious idea. But in any case, Nation was clearly pushing the idea that his new monster would have an elegantly curved surface, and therefore be visually different to the hard lines of the Daleks. Ray Cusick then designed it with flat surfaces. He also didn't follow the shape that Nation described, opting instead to make the Mechons essentially spherical. In fairness, the reason for this was likely to be one of budget. Making something of this size in fiberglass would not be cheap. Cusick no doubt had discussions with Shawcraft, who would have pointed out that if they only had to make one half, which could be duplicated, then this would reduce the time and money required in the mould making process. But of course the result was that the shape was symmetrical top and bottom, which would mean no taper, and therefore not the shape of the capstan as Nation envisaged. The angular surface may have been a cost-cutting measure too. Shawcraft could have made it curved, but it would have been a much more complex undertaking, so it was likely there were discussions between Bill Roberts and Ray Cusick to figure out what was the most ambitious thing which could be achieved on the tight budget. The end result was this design. He later said that he based the shape on the geodesic domes being popularised in architecture at the time by Richard Buckminster Fuller. It might seem surprising that Shawcraft didn't take greater advantage of the repeating symmetry. It would have been possible to only make a third, or a quarter, or even theoretically just a 12th of the shape, and then cast many identical sections. But in practice, trying to join multiple fiberglass panels together can be untidy and time-consuming, especially if it's important that they fit together neatly. And even to make a mould of just one section, they still had to work out the geometry for an entire hemisphere shape, in order to extract even just one panel. Given how daunting it must have been to build the initial pattern itself, moulding it would have been the least of their worries. Creating the structure isn't quite as difficult as it might appear. It would have started with a timber framework outline of the equator. Then they needed to make the same shape again, at the right distance off the ground, based on the specification in the blueprint, and then do the same again with the third tier at the top. It would have been a relatively simple task to cut the triangles to connect the points to make the panels all the way up, and then complete the shell all the way round. It's fun to think that at some stage a half Mechonoid existed in wood, looking something like this, and this was the master pattern. They would then have sealed the surface of the dome and covered it in fiberglass to create a negative copy of the entire shape. Once separated from the original, This would have formed a huge concave mould for making the halves of the prop. A layer of gel coat would have been painted inside, and then glass matting would have been stippled into all the awkward Toblerone shapes. If you're surprised that they didn't make a mould of one half of the hemisphere and save on some fiberglass, there was a good reason. Aside from the alignment problems already mentioned, if you've got half a mould, then it takes twice as long to cast everything, because you have to wait for each section to cure before you can demould it and move on to the next half. A full mould means no waiting around time, and one complete seamless piece is made with each casting. We were able to prove that the hemispheres were definitely made from one complete mould by unwrapping the surface of the entire prop and looking for any repeat in the uneven patterns in the fiberglass triangles. No two triangles have the same imperfections on the hemispheres, which means it's unique all the way round, and therefore one giant mould. But the time and money was saved by using the same shape for the top and bottom, and this duplication can be seen in the props. Here, the front of one Mechonoid has ripples in the fiberglass on its top half to the right of its flamethrower. The same ripples can be seen upside down on the lower half of this prop. The deadline for delivery was the 9th of April 1965, and the build team, which included Ron Nicholson and Brian Jones, made 3 full-sized Hero Mechonoids with extending flamethrower weapons and pivoting arms. They were painted blue, and the colour chosen was the same as had been used on the batch of Daleks which Shawcraft had supplied just 1 month earlier for the new movie starring Peter Cushing. The colour exactly matches that seen on these new props built for Doctor Who and the Daleks. The cost of each Mechonoid prop was £270, which was more than they had charged the BBC for each Dalek. They also supplied a visual effects prop for £70, which had a pre-cut shell and gubbins inside for pyrotechnic shots. But in Nation's Society of Machines, the Mechons weren't alone. If he'd had the budget, he probably would have had a whole host of different robots, but he wanted to have at least one other on screen, and it was included in his draft script. Do we know what this lost robot looked like? Well, yes, but don't get too excited. It's fair to say that Nation wasn't a particularly visually orientated person.
I did say to him once, I said, Terry, you often write in your scripts that they enter into a white, featureless room. They walk along a white, featureless tunnel. I said, why is everything white and featureless? He said, well, I couldn't think of anything else to say, really.
There is a good example of this when his Mechonoid is introduced within a large white-walled room. So, as you'll see, although Nation did devise another robot for the chase, it wouldn't have been the most thrilling addition to the Doctor Who canon. He described it as a large metal box. And just before you get any ideas that this might have been some kind of dynamic metal box, he specifies that it's lumbering. Nation says simply it is a robot cleaner. And in case the first description wasn't clear enough, he clarifies with a note, just a box. But wait, there's more. It has rotating polishing pads front and rear. He also gives it aerials and some flashing dome lights, as per the Mechons. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say this was to denote a shared technology, and not because he was out of ideas. The Doctor is given a line of dialogue for the benefit of the audience to explain what we're looking at. Fascinating, he says. Utterly fascinating. A robot cleaner. Barbara notes, you wouldn't have any trouble selling those on Earth. This is because she has a keen mind for business opportunities in the emerging technology sector, and not because she's a woman whose life therefore revolves around housework.
Honestly, one of these days I'm going to have a jolly good spring clean around here.
In Nation's draft script, the defenseless cleaning robot is attacked by the Daleks as they rampage through the Mechon city, and is left smouldering against a wall. Stage directions indicate to then cut to a lick of flame appearing, and then cut back to the dead robot, specifically suggesting that the destruction of the cleaning robot is what actually starts the fire, which results in the eventual collapse of the entire city. Terry Nation's ambitious ideas, which formed part of his Society of Machines, were never realised, and the Mechonoids were, ultimately, balls. But what fun designs these are, even if they didn't quite become as popular as was hoped. They went before the cameras on April 15th, 1965 for the pre-filmed sequences at Ealing Film Studios, and these shots would later be inserted into the battle for Episode 6. This day saw a famous photo call in which the producer Verity Lambert lit up a cigarette on the Mechonoid's flamethrower. Stage weights had to be used to weigh down the bases of the Mechonoids because it was discovered that the huge props had a propensity to roll. 6 weeks later, one prop was required for the weekly studio work, showing the brief reveal of the new robots at the end of episode 5. This 20 seconds of screen time was recorded on the 28th of May, and the man inside was Murphy Grumbar. The following week saw the Mechonoid's final use in Doctor Who, and inside the two other casings, John Scott Martin, who was also making his debut as a Dalek operator, and Jack Pitt, who had also played the ship's steward on the Mary Celeste, and gave perhaps the greatest performance of his career inside the Maya Beast. It's remarkable that for all their fanfare, these incredibly expensive new props had a total screen time of just over 4 minutes, including all the dramatic footage shot at Ealing. These sadly underused creations continued to battle their old enemies the Daleks off-screen, starting in the Dalek World Annual in October 1965. And an interesting element seen in the artwork are these robot bugs, which appear to be pottering around on the floor and also tending to this Mechonoid, another member of the Society of Machines. The strip also features the alternative spelling of Mechonoid with an A, which would often be seen thereafter, despite the fact that the end credits in the TV series had already established the spelling with an O, following the logic of the robot's original shorter name of Mechon. The shorter name appears in the draft script and is accidentally retained in one line of Dalek dialogue in the broadcast television serial.
The Mechons have forced us to take action.
The Mechonoids next made an appearance in TV21 comics at Christmas 1965 in a strip called The Eve of War, which reveals the appearance of their spaceship design and also introduces their leader called Menoid. There were 2 toys made. This is a rare example of the Cherry version released in 1965, and this one is owned by Mick Hall. The company also produced this Dalek too. A second toy was made by Hertz, and these were very accurate indeed. Hertz famously produced a Dalek too, which was used in the production line for Power of the Daleks. The final item to feature them was this set of transfers made by Tower Press. It too was released in 1965, hoping to capitalise on that epic 4 minutes of screen time that the new monsters had been given. They appear again in TV21, making their last appearance in the strip called Empass, which finished in May 1966 and ended the rotund robot's brief fame. In more recent times, 2011 saw Character release a 5-inch action figure of a Mechonoid in a set along with the Daleks, and in October 2016, the Doctor Who Figurine Collection Special Issue number 9 was a Mechonoid. I had the privilege of providing the sculpt for this figurine, and it was based on a model I had previously used to create artwork for the DVD Files issue 71. For the DVD Files artwork, I'd been given a brief to show the triangular panels disconnected to reveal more useful tools than what was seen on screen, and this borrowed heavily from the superb design work of Librarian-Bot, who did it far better than me and whose work can be seen on DeviantArt. Various images from this episode are available to download on our Patreon, where some of our kind and generous supporters saw this episode almost 2 weeks early. There's a link in the description if you would like to join. And just while we're on the subject of redesigns and concept art, my other favourite is the immensely talented Arne Niklas Jansson, who has done a wonderful collection of concept designs for a Doctor Who game. I absolutely love his Mechonoid variants, but everything on that page is beautifully done. Check out the link in the description. So what happened to these ungainly props after their last studio day on the 4th of June 1965? Storage must have been a nightmare given their size. One was kept for at least a little while at Shawcraft's workshop, as this was amongst the collection of props wheeled out just over a month after recording on Saturday the 10th of July 1965 for the Southall Carnival. Almost exactly 1 year later, on the 12th of July 1966, graphics and effects manager Tony Foster went down to Ealing to assess the situation regarding the storage of Doctor Who items. Foster had been informed that their allocated storage area was no longer available, and therefore they had to make decisions about large items taking up space. He wrote to Doctor Who producer Innes Lloyd that day to say that most space was taken up with 4 Daleks, 3 Mechonoids, 3 Chumbleys, and some other panels and desks. Foster suggested that, with the exception of the Daleks, all these items should be disposed of, unless they would definitely be used in future. Frustratingly, we don't know the outcome of this exchange, but it's just possible that because the Mechonoids had appeared in a comic 2 months earlier, they might just have had a reprieve on this occasion. if there was even a tiny bit of optimism that they could come back to the show. And according to the recollection of longtime Doctor Who fan John Field, he saw a Mechonoid in storage in the early 1970s, so it might just be possible there was still one lurking somewhere when Day of the Daleks was being recorded. In the mid-1990s, prop maker Toby Chamberlain was given an open-ended commission to build something unusual for Les Hollis and Vortex Events as they toured the UK with a series of conventions in 1995. Since no one else had built one before, Toby chose to make a full-sized Mechonoid. He used the same process of making a timber master, but unlike Shawcraft, he was able to take the more efficient route of moulding and casting a quarter of the entire shape. He worked partly from the original plans from the BBC, but since these weren't screen accurate, he had to use his skill to interpret the shape from photos and also use one of the 1960s toys as reference, courtesy of Mick Hall. The finished prop was extremely impressive and drew great attention, being the only one of its kind. It went on to tour places including Leeds, as seen here in 1995, Heathrow, Exeter and Chester. But just as the BBC had found, storage was a big problem, and after changing hands, it was left to fall into disrepair. But thankfully it was salvaged by Tony Myers and Dave Price, who restored it extensively in 2003 in time for an appearance at the Dimensions convention in Stockton. And it was at this convention that Ray Cusick revealed there was, in fact, one screen-used Mechonoid still surviving. To the delight of onlookers, he pulled from his pocket the tiny miniature made from green jabalite with two little wire arms, which had been used in the model sequence filming of the Mechonoid City. The full-sized replica appeared the following year at Doctor Who and the Daleks 2 at the Gladstone Hotel in Liverpool. After that it was on display at Blackpool until 2009. In 2013 it appeared on eBay, and it now resides in the Time Machine Museum of Science Fiction in Bromyard. It is, as far as we know, the only full-sized Mechonoid anywhere in the world, replica or otherwise. But if you know any different, let us know in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this non-Dalek episode. It was originally going to be a TNA extra of about 5 minutes long, but thanks to a lot of brilliant people like Richard Bignell, as ever, and Sam Payne, we got more and more information and material. There's a strong chance we'll do something about Shawcraft next, and if you're interested in what we're uncovering and staying up to date with the next episodes, or if you just want to show your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this content, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Congratulations to Philip Kerry and Jason Boyce, who are the winners of the 1960s Dalek and Ice Warrior fragments, generously donated as prizes by Matthew Doe at the Movie Reliquary. Don't forget to visit the link in the description for 60% off the Big Finish Audio Masters of Luxor. See you in the next one. A fun game you can play in this episode is to re-watch and try to work out which words or sentences I had to re-record after I lost my voice this week.